Do you normally take risks, or do you prefer to take the safe option? Do you think it might be possible to manipulate a risk-averse person into becoming risk-seeking, merely by reframing the formulation of the choice they are facing? You can imagine the security consequences of that. Hang around, and in today's video I'll introduce you to someone who won a Nobel Prize for figuring that one out. Welcome to Stajano Explains. I'm Professor of Security and Privacy at the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge, and this is one of the last few videos in my lecture course on security for second-year undergraduates. Today's topic is human factors in security. It is only relatively recently, over the past couple of decades or so, that the security research community has come to acknowledge the importance of human factors in cybersecurity. Our purpose as security engineers must not be merely to secure computers, but to secure systems that depend on computers. And these complex socio-technical systems include, besides the computers and their peripherals and their software and their network connections to other computers, also the people who use those computers, the people who maintain them, the people who write software for them, the people who define the security policy for them, and so on. And all these elements are interconnected. Those security professionals who only deal with the organizational, sociological and relationship level but are not capable of writing the payload to exploit a buffer overflow vulnerability, in my opinion, cannot legitimately call themselves cybersecurity experts, although they could always learn by studying my videos and doing the seed labs as you have been doing so far. On the other hand, someone who is highly skilled at assembly language and network protocols and so on, but lacks sufficient understanding of how non-geeks use computers, will never be able to design and build secure systems. It's not a security expert either. You need both skill sets, and a holistic approach is needed. The most valuable, most sought after, and most highly paid security expert is the one who can solve real-world problems. It's someone who is simultaneously competent about the technical aspects, but also able to relate to the role of computer systems in serving and supporting the inhabitants of a digital society that is populated primarily by non-nerds, because it is for them ultimately that the systems must work well. As I said about other subtopics, a whole lecture course could be devoted just to human factors in security. Whatever I might choose to say in today's video will omit many other important things, so let me arbitrarily select just 3 topics with the intention of arousing your interest and curiosity. There's plenty more interesting research to be done in this direction. And what would you like to contribute to the field if you one day continued into graduate studies, perhaps with me? So our first topic for today is inspired by a paper titled "Users are not the enemy." If the technical intricacies of computer security are too obscure for ordinary software developers, who after all continue to write code containing buffer overflow vulnerabilities, SQL injection vulnerabilities, and so on, then imagine for non-geek users. There's a wide mismatch between security techies and regular human beings, both in their respective understanding of how computers and their security mechanisms work on one hand, and in how much they care about those security mechanisms on the other hand. This has too often led to security techies adopting a detrimental us and them attitude of the system I designed would be totally secure if only those idiot users behaved as instructed. And you can hear the contempt in the often repeated assertion that human is the weakest link, meaning computers are infallible, it's just the stupid humans who make mistakes. This misguided mindset only serves to alienate users, who in turn see the security techies as arrogant guards who put annoying obstacles in their way. Think VPNs, multi-factor authentication tokens, and so forth, which they need to endure or somehow bypass in order to get any work done. These attitudes put the security techies and the non-techies at loggerheads, a highly counterproductive setting, whereas the two groups should instead cooperate to protect their organization from attackers. Highlighting the fact that the infight between security administrators and users was an absurd waste of resources for the organization was the thesis of the 1999 paper by Anne Adams and Angela Sasse, "Users are not the enemy," one of the first articles in the literature about the usability of security, and still a highly recommended read today. Valuable insights from that work include the following. Insufficient communication with users produces unusable systems. If the security designers are techies and they don't talk with regular users during development, then the end result will only be usable by other techies. Users forced to comply with security mechanisms that are incompatible with their work practices will necessarily look for workarounds, such as sharing passwords to delegate access rights or transferring files through USB drives rather than via the recommended encrypted channels. Users are not bad people. They just need to get their work done, because that's what determines their promotion, not whether they comply with some BS security policy. The claim that users are never motivated to behave securely is wrong. Treat the users as stakeholders and they will gladly cooperate, provide feedback, guidance, awareness, and usable security mechanisms. Another valuable insight about the dynamics of this interaction between security administrators and regular employees comes from a 2008 paper from the same research group, The Compliance Budget: Managing Security Behavior in Organizations. The thesis of that paper, based on interviews with corporate employees on whether they complied with their company's security policy, is that users have a finite supply of goodwill, which the authors indicate as a compliance budget. Every act of complying with some annoying bit of corporate security policy makes a withdrawal on that budget. And when the balance is zero or negative, then there's no goodwill left, and the user will resort to workarounds rather than complying with further requests by then perceived as totally unreasonable. Therefore, the paper recommends managing the compliance budget as wisely as one would any financial budget, spending its finite resources only on what matters most. In other words, harassing users with petty security requests might have the counterproductive result that they won't follow the security policy on more serious matters. The paper says, once the compliance threshold is crossed, security effectiveness drops sharply as altruistic behavior is increasingly exchanged for selfish options. Let's now come to our second big idea today. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman invented prospect theory in 1979 and pioneered the discipline of behavioral economics. Their work led to a Nobel Prize in Economics for Kahneman in 2002, which Tversky would have shared if he had still been alive. I highly recommend you watch the lecture that Kahneman gave when he got the Nobel Prize. It's well worth understanding at least the basic ideas of prospect theory, because there are valuable insights on the decision strategies that people use in various contexts, including security-relevant contexts. The previous mainstream theory on how people make choices, in particular financial decisions, which was called expected utility theory, was put forward by Daniel Bernoulli in 1738, and it explained why the first million you earn is worth more to you than your second, and why people seem risk-averse in general. For example, would you accept the following gamble? Heads, you win $101. Tails, you lose $100. Clearly, you stand to gain a little more than you would lose, and basic arithmetic tells us that the expected outcome in terms of wealth is $0.50 plus $0.50, and therefore, since it's positive, you should have a very slight incentive to gamble. However, in practice, if you try this on your friends, most people refuse to risk their $100, unless the incentive is rather more substantial than $0.50 expected value. Why? Are they being rational? Why do they pass up this chance of making a little money? What would you do? Well, the value you ascribe to money, Bernoulli said, does not grow proportionally to how much of it you have. Let me draw a graph. If you have wealth W on the horizontal axis and the utility of wealth on the vertical axis, then the graph of the utility of wealth is not linear, like this, but it's logarithmic, like this. Logarithmic means that what matters is not how much you add, but by how much you multiply. So what I mean is that if you start with, say, $10,000 as your wealth, and then you get to $100,000, that's an increase in wealth of $90,000. And this gives you some satisfaction, some increase in utility based on the increase of that wealth. Now, to get the same satisfaction again, adding another 90,000 won't do. You need to have the same factor of 10 from 10,000 to 100,000, and then go to 1,000,000 instead of going just to 190,000. That's what the utility of wealth being logarithmic means. So Bernoulli then explained that the rational strategy is to base your choice on the expected outcome in terms of utility of wealth rather than in terms of just wealth. So from this viewpoint, because this function uw being logarithmic is concave, then the utility of being richer by $101 is actually closer to the utility of your current wealth than the utility of being poorer by $100. So let me show you this over here. And actually, let's make this bigger. Let's say that this is now my wealth at the moment, and I'm offered a gamble where I might win or I might lose. And let's say that this gamble is exactly symmetric, so I might win $50 or lose $50. Then there will be points on either side of my current wealth, like this, which are 50 here and 50 there. And if the utility of wealth were a linear function, as this line here in green, then these amounts resulting from the different outcomes of the gamble would be symmetric in utility with respect to the utility of not gambling at all. So this is the utility of not gambling. This is the utility of gambling and winning. This is the utility of gambling and losing. And if I average them, then the average of these two is this one, which is the same utility as not gambling at all. Now, in another color, let's say in red, let me take the same choice between not betting or betting on something that has an outcome that could be minus $50 or plus $50. And what happens to the utility of my wealth? Well, what happens to the utility of my wealth is that in this case, if I go to the curve in red, which is a concave curve, then over here I reach the curve at a lower point than the line, and so I'll be here. I will be closer to this center than in the case of linear. And in this other case, I will instead be further away from the middle point than in here. So there's this asymmetry in here, whereby this part is much shorter than this other part due to the concavity of this curve. So the average of these two outcomes in terms of utility, even though the average in terms of wealth is the same as the wealth of when I don't bet, the average of the utilities of the cases where I bet ends up somewhere down here, which is lower than the utility of the case where I don't bet. And so it means for me, the expected value of betting is that I'm going to lose out compared to not betting, because I'm going to be here instead of being here. And this is why it is reasonable not to want to bet if the odds are the same, or even if they are slightly more favorable to in case of the win. Even if when I win $101, but when I lose $100. It's still not enough to move this point sufficiently up that it overtakes this other point. And so Bernoulli explains this is why people are risk averse, because they somehow internalize, understand that this utility of wealth is concave, and therefore the uncertainty of the outcome leads to an average that is lower down than the case of not betting. And this is a powerful insight. However, a couple of centuries later, Tversky and Kahneman produced experimental evidence of cases in which this expected utility theory was wrong. In a sense, its predictions diverged from the actual choices of the experimental subjects. In their experiments, while subjects were indeed risk-averse some of the time, in other cases they were risk-seeking, which was unexplained by Bernoulli's theory. Try the following experiment yourself. Okay, imagine that you face the following pair of concurrent decisions. First, examine both decisions and then indicate the options that you prefer. So first decision, you have to choose between A and B. A, a sure gain of $240. Would you like that? Otherwise, B. You will get a 25% chance to gain $1,000 and a 75% chance to gain nothing. Otherwise, you can have A, a sure gain of $240. So you have to choose between A and B. And the second decision, separate decision, you have to choose between C and D. In C, you get a sure loss of $750. And in case D, you get 75% chance to lose $1,000 and a 25% chance to lose nothing. If you don't like to gamble, then you can have C, a sure loss of $750. So you choose between C and D. So you have to come up with one of A and B and one of C and D. Now, please stop the video, think about your choice, and only restart when you figured out what you would do. You must pick one from each of these pairs of choices. Stop the video now. Okay, so what pair of choices did you pick? AC, AD, BC, or BD? Tversky and Kahneman administered the experiment to 150 subjects and found that in the case of decision 1, an overwhelming majority, 84%, chose the certain gain of option A versus the uncertain gain of option B, even though the expected gain in option B is $250, which is marginally greater than the $240 of option A. So this risk aversion, so I don't like to do this even if I would gain slightly more, is exactly as predicted by expected utility theory. However, in the case of decision 2, an equally overwhelming majority of the experimental subjects, namely 87%, preferred the gamble of option D, which included the possibility of losing nothing versus the certain loss of option C, even though the expected loss in option D was the same as in option C, and therefore by expected utility theory the expected loss in utility would have been greater in option D than in option C because of the graphical explanation I gave you earlier. So why? Why is that? The discriminant between risk aversion and risk seeking, they explained, was whether the problem was reframed as a gain or a loss. In other words, although people were indeed unwilling to gamble in order to secure a gain, they preferred to gamble in order to avoid a loss. Another insightful finding was that people were significantly more sensitive to losses than to gains. They disliked a loss much more than they liked a gain of the same magnitude. So on that basis, Tversky and Kahneman came up with this qualitative graph illustrating a hypothetical value function. First of all, the x-axis is not absolute wealth as it was with Bernoulli's expected utility theory, but rather relative changes in wealth with respect to some reference position here at the origin. So we call them gains and losses. This accounts for the influence of framing effects. It's the difference from your previous position that matters, not the absolute value. In the first quadrant, where there is a positive increase in wealth and a corresponding positive increase in utility, the curve is concave, which accounts for risk aversion with respect to gains, the same graphical explanation I gave you earlier. Now, in the third quadrant, where there's a decrease in wealth corresponding to a decrease in utility, the curve is instead convex. And this change in concavity accounts for risk-seeking behavior with respect to losses. Notice also the curve is much steeper by a factor of about 2 in the third quadrant than it is in the first. And this takes into account the fact that people are much more sensitive to losses than to gains. If an increase in wealth results in a certain increase in utility, then a decrease in wealth by the same amount results in a much greater in absolute value decrease in utility. And then notice that both the positive and the negative portions of the graph flatten out towards the horizontal as you go towards infinity. Both higher gains and higher losses become progressively less relevant in proportion. So the second million you earn or you lose doesn't matter as much as the first. Now you might still wonder, why does concave make us risk averse and convex makes us risk seeking? So let's go back to our graphical explanation. This is the wealth and this is the utility of the wealth. And this is a concave function of the utility of wealth. And if this is my situation if I don't gamble, and if the gamble is a symmetric, a 50-50 gamble, where I might lose this much or gain just the same amount, then the average of how much I gain and how much I lose is the same as my wealth if I don't bet, if I don't gamble. However, the utility, if I go up my curve, this is the utility I get if I win, this is the utility I get if I lose, and this is the utility of me not betting at all. Then the average of the utility of winning and the utility of losing is somewhere here, which is lower than the utility of not betting. And this is what makes me risk averse, because my expected value on gambling is lower than my expected value on not gambling. And so risk aversion in case of concave curve. Now let me do this trick of putting this upside down. So now the curve is convex instead of concave. So what happens here? Well, this is my situation if I don't gamble and I'm here. This is my situation if I lose, I'm here. This is the situation if I win and I'm here. And now the average between the utility of winning and losing is higher than the utility of not gambling. And so that is what makes me risk-seeking in case of a convex utility of wealth function. And this explains all the main features of this qualitative diagram, which represents prospect theory. An understanding of the psychology of decision-making, including the various cognitive biases that may lead to outcomes that contradict what a logical or a rational approach might otherwise suggest, is important for the security engineer. We need to design systems that will be secure in the face of how real-world users will actually use them. And towards that, the more we understand about how users will respond, and the better equipped we will be to build a system that nudges users towards a safer outcome. And this leads very nicely into our third topic for today, which is a paper called Understanding Scam Victims: 7 Principles for System Security, that I wrote with one of the most interesting and colorful characters I ever had as a co-author on an academic paper: magician, deception expert, pickpocket, and TV presenter Paul Wilson. Check out this EFF reported Facebook phishing attack targeting Syrian activists in 2012. The page looks like Facebook, but it was set up by pro-Syrian government hackers to entrap Syrian activists. If you look closely, the URL is not Facebook's URL. Security engineers build systems defenses largely based on how they think users should respond to threats. From the engineer's viewpoint, just reading the URL would tell you straight away that it isn't Facebook. But normally users are not engineers. They respond differently. They don't understand the syntax of URLs. They don't understand the difference between the HTTPS padlock and a picture of a padlock in the page itself. As a result of this mismatch, systems are vulnerable. We, security engineers, need to understand how users really behave and what psychological traits make them vulnerable. Usually engineers don't understand user psychology too well, but fraudsters do. Therefore, engineers should learn from fraudsters in order to build systems that are actually secure. There was this brilliant TV show on BBC Three called The Real Hustle by Paul Wilson and Alex Conran that aired for 11 series between 2006 and 2012. And it documented hundreds of actual scams and frauds, recreating them for hidden cameras. And I found it really fun and addictive. So I watched it religiously on TV. Now it has its own YouTube channel, so you may watch the videos on demand and have fun with that. Now, as I watched, I started wondering, were all these hundreds of scams completely original, or did they just reuse a few basic ideas? And I suspected the latter, and so I set out to identify some kind of a basis for the vector space of frauds. What are the fundamental things that if you combine, you can get all possible scams? And after coming up with some initial draft of my idea, that's when I got in touch with Paul. And he was happy to collaborate on this. He found it fun as well. And we identified 7 principles that explain fundamental system vulnerabilities, so to say, of the human psyche that fraudsters have been exploiting long before computers were invented. So an understanding of these principles is necessary to build secure systems, not just computer systems, any systems that involve people. So the contributions we put forward in our paper was, first of all, that we documented a number of existing scams. That was largely done by the TV show work that Paul had done with his colleagues. We extracted underlying principles from the scams, and we applied these principles to strengthen system security. So here's one example of the many scams we documented and analyzed, the ring reward ripoff, which comes from the 4th episode of Series 1. The gorgeous Jess buys a cheap ring from a market stall for only £5. She then goes to a pub and seductively befriends the barman, the Mark. She makes it obvious she's very rich. Showing off to her friend, who is a shill, she makes sure the Mark overhears that she just received this amazing £3,500 diamond ring for her birthday. She then leaves. Paul and Alex arrive at the pub, posing as 2 blokes having a pint. Jess then phones the pub, very worried, calling her friend the barman by name, saying she lost that very precious ring. Could he check if it's there somewhere? The Mark checks, and luckily a customer, Paul, found the ring. However, instead of handing it over, Paul demands a reward. The barman gets back to the phone, and Jess, very relieved to hear the ring is there, says without prompting that she'll give £200 to the person who found it. But the barman goes back to Paul and says the reward is only £20. That's when the hustlers know they've got him. He's trying to make some profit for himself. Paul haggles a bit and eventually returns the ring to the barman for £50. The Mark is all too happy to advance the money to Paul, expecting to get much more from Jess. But Jess, of course, never calls him back. And then at the end of the episode, a convicted criminal proudly says this is a good scam and he once made a £2,000 profit from this particular hustle. This scam relies primarily on what we call the dishonesty principle in our paper. The Mark, the barman, is lured into paying Paul because he realizes he will be cheating him out of a much larger reward that Jess promised. However, the fact that he intended to cheat will make him unlikely to complain to the police once the reward never materializes, because he would have to confess to his own fraudulent intentions. This same principle is at the core of the very widespread computer-based fraud known as the 419, or the Nigerian scam, or the advance fee fraud, in which criminals send victims emails that ask for assistance in expatriating millions of dollars from the bankroll of a family member of a wealthy prince, and the Mark would obviously get a good fraction of that, but they have to help with little bribes to make the transfer go through. And once the victims realize that they have been conned, they would be reluctant to seek help from the police because they would have to confess to their complicity in essentially money laundering and evasion of currency control regulations. Some victims in real life have actually gone bankrupt, and some others have even committed suicide, seeing no way out of this dilemma because they felt they were not in a position to ask for help. Other principles at work in the ring reward ripoff include need and greed and time. Need and greed is whereby some urges, cravings, and desires, including both the prospect of a monetary reward and the seductive attractiveness of Jess, become powerful ways that the hustlers can use to manipulate the victim. And the time principle is where the fact that an opportunity will disappear soon forces the victim to decide quickly using fallible heuristics instead of proper cool-headed reasoning. So we observed and documented and dissected hundreds of frauds, but almost all of them can be reduced to a handful of general principles that explain what victims fall for. The following table from our 2009 tech report that predated the official paper illustrates which combination of our principles is exploited by each of the scams under analysis. The exact set of principles doesn't matter that much. In fact, we even changed between the initial tech report and the paper. And it's not as important as the idea that almost all scams can be reduced to just a handful of principles. The relevance of this idea to the security engineer is because these principles are also responsible for vulnerabilities in computer systems. These principles are in the human psyche. They have been exploited by fraudsters for centuries before computers were invented. They are rooted in human nature and they're not going to go away. You should acknowledge them, you should deal with their existence, and you should abandon any hope to overcome them by just issuing instructions to users. These are the 7 principles that we distilled, graced by cute cartoons by my friend Silvia Zicke. Normally when I give a talk about this, I illustrate each principle with examples from the real hustle and I show the videos. And here, in the interest of keeping the lecture to a reasonable length, I'll just drop a link to the Real Hustle YouTube channel in the description, and you can spend as much time on that as you like, and you can have fun identifying for yourself which principles are used in each scam. We begin with the dishonesty principle that I talked about at length. Your larceny is what hooks you. Thereafter, anything illegal you do will be used against you by the fraudster. Then the distraction principle. While you are distracted by what retains your interest, hustlers can do anything to you and you won't notice. This is a key ingredient in magic tricks, for example, where the magician is going to do something over here but misdirects you into looking over there so that you won't notice. And obviously most successful frauds, including computer-based frauds, will have some element of distraction, some kind of cover story to make you think, it's plausible to do this and I shouldn't be suspicious about what's actually happening. We next have what we call the herd principle, which others may call the social proof. Even suspicious marks will let their guard down when others next to them appear to share the same risks. Safety in numbers, not if they're all against you. The truth is that the fraudsters may make you feel you have safety in numbers, but actually all the others who are doing the thing that they want you to do are shills, accomplices of the hustlers. We then have the kindness principle. People are fundamentally nice and willing to help, and hustlers shamelessly take advantage of it. This is a kind of dual of the dishonesty principle. The crooks figure you out, and once they've understood if you're more towards good or bad, they can hustle you either way. Then what we call the need and greed principle. Need and greed make you vulnerable. Once hustlers know what you want, they can easily manipulate you. And we, in our original formulation, we just called this greed, and then we switched to need and greed to indicate that there are some irresistible pulsions that you just can do nothing about. And we felt it was wrong to say just greed and implicitly putting the blame on the victim, because there are sometimes cases where you just can't resist, and the mirage of the Nigerian prince with all those millions coming towards you may actually be a need and not merely greed if you are in financial dire straits and you've just been evicted from your home. Next we have the social compliance principle, which others might call the authority principle. Society trains people not to question authority. Hustlers exploit this suspension of suspiciousness to manipulate you by impersonating a figure of authority, by making it sound like someone you should trust and obey asks you to do something. And this is exploited, for example, in the kind of email-based frauds that pretend to come from your system administrator or from your bank that tell you, do this, otherwise we will close your account. And you say, this is authority says that, I'd better do that. And our 7th principle is time. When you are under time pressure to make an important choice, you use a different decision strategy. Hustlers steer you towards a strategy involving less reasoning. And for confirmation from someone who really knows what he's talking about, look no further than Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, we mentioned earlier, whose latest bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a fascinating read and tells you everything about the use of a different decision strategy when you are pressured for time. Now, after distilling this initial set of 7 principles by observing frauds and fraudsters, in the course of our literature survey, we discovered striking similarities with the principles that psychologist Robert Cialdini identified by observing salesmen and published in his classic book Influence, Science and Practice. And in hindsight, that's appropriate, because after all, the techniques of fraudsters and the techniques of pushy salesmen are very similar. And perhaps the main difference between the two groups is that at least sometimes what the salesmen do is legal. Another relevant work was that by Stephen Lee and others, who wrote an extensive report on mass market scams for the Office of Fair Trading in the UK. And here's a table summarizing the commonalities. Our conclusions on this matter is that it is arrogantly idiotic for security engineers to whinge that users are gullible. Certain behavior patterns are simply human nature. The smart security engineers must acknowledge their inevitability and must design the system to prevent their exploitation. In the forthcoming concluding 2 videos of this course, we will look at computer viruses and other malicious software, and also at physical security and the interesting parallels between mechanical locks and cybersecurity systems. In particular, we'll demonstrate a privilege escalation attack on physical door locks. How can a crooked employee use the key to his office to open the door of the CEO's office? Do not miss these other videos. If you made it this far, leave a comment mentioning chewing gum. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll meet again in the next video.